I was folding laundry when the phone call came. Not screaming, not crying, just folding. A stack of Daniel's undershirts, pressed into thirds the way I've done for 11 years. The dryer still ticking as it cooled behind me, when the loan officer on the other end of the line asked me to confirm my current employment status for the business refinance application. I'm sorry, I said. What refinance? There was a pause on her end. The kind of pause that tells you someone realizes they've said something they weren't supposed to say. Papers shuffled. A keyboard clicked somewhere far away. The application for Whitfield Restoration Group, she said carefully, reading now instead of speaking. Filed last Tuesday. It lists you as a non-income earning spouse with no ownership stake in the business. I finished folding the shirt in my hands. I set it on the pile, squared the corners the way I always do, and I said, very calmly, I own 50% of that company. On paper, in the county records, and in a document my husband signed in front of a notary 6 years ago. She apologized, said there must have been some confusion, an intake error. She'd have someone look into it. I told her there was no confusion at all, and asked her, politely, to email me a full copy of the application, not the summary, the full packet. She said she'd have to check with the loan officer of record. I told her I'd wait. She sent it 11 minutes later. I hung up. I finished folding the laundry. I put the basket away exactly where it belonged, on the third shelf of the hallway closet, the way I've done every Sunday evening for 11 years. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and read. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 39 years old, and I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my days finding the money other people hope never gets found. The transfer buried 3 shell companies deep. The invoice that was altered by $4, and then by $4,000. The number that doesn't add up, because someone assumed nobody would ever check closely enough to notice. My job exists because most people believe records are boring, that ledgers are just grey columns nobody reads twice. I've always believed the opposite. A record is a confession that simply hasn't been read yet. It's just sitting there, waiting for someone patient enough to ask it the right question. I grew up watching my mother get quietly written out of decisions that were supposed to be hers too. A house sold on terms she didn't fully understand. A retirement account she didn't know existed until the year it was already gone. Spent by someone she trusted completely. Nobody screamed at her. Nobody had to. All they had to do was leave her name off the right line, and she simply stopped existing in the parts of the story that mattered. I watched that happen to her from the time I was 12 years old, and I promised myself, quietly, the way children make promises they don't fully understand yet, that I would never be a woman who didn't know exactly what was on paper, with her own name attached to it. That promise is the reason I became who I am. It's the reason I chose the profession I did. People sometimes ask me why a career built entirely around suspicion never made me a suspicious person in my own marriage. I've thought about that question more than I'd like to admit. The truth is I wasn't suspicious of Daniel for 11 years, not once, not for a single day, because suspicion was never the point of my rule about reading everything with my name on it. The point was never distrust. The point was simply refusing to let my own understanding of my own life depend on someone else's willingness to explain it to me. I would have made sure my name was protected on that paperwork even if I had married the most honest man alive. As it turned out, I hadn't. Daniel and I met when he was still swinging a hammer for someone else's contracting company, sunburned and restless, full of plans he had no capital for. I was finishing my CPA license and doing the books for 3 small local businesses on the side, careful and exact in a way that made older men twice my age start asking my opinion before they made decisions. He had the vision. I had the discipline and, as it happened, $40,000 from a settlement after a car accident that could have gone toward anything, a house down payment, a safety net, a future I built entirely alone. I chose, instead, to put it into us. We signed the partnership papers at this same kitchen table, 11 years ago this spring. 50-50, notarized, filed with the county. I did the books, the tax filings, the vendor contracts, quietly, from a laptop most people never saw. He ran the cruise, shook hands with clients, became, in the eyes of everyone who ever met him, the face of Whitfield Restoration Group. I never minded being the face behind the face. That was the arrangement we chose together, eyes open, and for a long time it worked exactly the way we'd planned it. There was a man named Marcus, who joined the business in year 3, hired as Daniel's project manager, and within a year, treated more like a brother than an employee. Marcus had a gift for making you feel like the smartest person in any room, right up until you realized, much later, that he'd been the one quietly steering the conversation the entire time. He came to our house for dinner. He stood beside Daniel at his own father's funeral. I liked him. Everyone liked him. I've learned since then that admiration and envy can wear the exact same face for years, and it took me far too long to understand which one Marcus was actually wearing around my husband. There was an early scene I still think about, from our 3rd year of marriage, when Daniel's mother sat across from me at a holiday dinner, and told the whole table, laughing, that she was relieved Daniel had finally found someone practical to keep the books straight, while he did the real work. Nobody at that table meant any harm by it. It was the kind of comment people make without thinking, the kind that gets absorbed into the walls of a marriage so slowly you don't notice it accumulating year after year. I laughed along with everyone else that night. I told myself it didn't matter what people called the arrangement, only what the paperwork said. I believe now that comment planted something in Daniel too, some quiet permission to think of my half of the business as decorative rather than real, even if he never once said so out loud, even to himself, for 8 more years. For a stretch of nearly 2 years, the business struggled in ways that never fully made sense to me. A brutal winter that slowed 3 major projects, 2 subcontractor lawsuits that ate deep into our margins, a warehouse lease I had personally approved that cost more than it should have, month after month, for reasons I could never quite trace to the bottom of. I carried a private guilt about that entire stretch, a guilt I never once said out loud to Daniel, because I believed, quietly, persistently for years, that I was the reason we had nearly lost everything we'd built. I worked harder. I took on outside clients to cover our gap months. I told myself this was simply the cost of a mistake only I had made. So when the loan officer's full application packet finished loading that evening, I read it the same clinical way I read every file at work. No panic in my hands, just attention. The application listed Daniel as sole proprietor of Whitfield Restoration Group. It listed our household income using only his personal draws from the business. It listed me, by name, Claire Whitfield, as non-contributing spouse, homemaker, no verifiable income. 11 years of joint tax returns, bearing my signature on every K1 form, erased by a single drop-down menu, somewhere in an online application. I didn't call him, I didn't text him, I made myself a cup of tea, the same way I do every evening, and I opened a new folder on my laptop, and I named it the same flat, clinical way I name every case file I've ever worked. No emotion in the title. Just facts. Then I did what I do for a living, the only way I know how to fight anything. I began to gather everything before he knew I had seen it. That is my rule, in this house and in every audit I've ever run, and it has never once failed me. Over the following 9 days, while Daniel came home each evening talking about supply orders and subcontractor schedules as though nothing in the world had shifted beneath us, I built a file the way I would for any client sitting across from me at work. I pulled the original operating agreement from the county recorder's office. I pulled 6 years of our joint tax filings, every K1, every signature page. I quietly requested, through a colleague at the bank who owed me a favor from years ago, the complete loan application packet, rather than the partial summary I'd first received. And what I found there was worse than a drop-down error. The refinance wasn't small. It was for $410,000, structured directly against the business's equity, with subordination language that would have placed my ownership stake behind the new lender's lien position entirely. If that loan had funded the way it was written, and if the business had later defaulted for any reason, I could have lost my half of everything I had personally built, using my own money, at my own risk, 11 years ago, without ever having signed a single document authorizing any of it. My name would have simply ceased to matter to the outcome. People who believe they will never be caught tend to leave the messiest trails because they've never had to imagine anyone looking closely enough to find them. Daniel hadn't hidden his emails. He hadn't hidden his 3 separate calls with the loan officer, each one a little more specific than the last, about streamlining the paperwork and avoiding delays with the co-borrower. He hadn't even hidden his texts to Marcus, which was, in the end, the strangest part of everything I found, because they weren't gloating messages. They were frightened ones. One read, "If she finds out before the funding closes, we're both finished." Not, "I'm finished. We're." That single word sat with me longer than anything else in the entire file. Whatever this was, it wasn't only my husband's secret to carry. I spent the 6th night cross-referencing every subcontractor invoice from the 2 hard years against the actual permits pulled for each job. A technique I use constantly at work and almost never expect to need in my own home. It's tedious, unglamorous work. Matching dates, matching addresses, matching dollar amounts down to the cent. And most people who commit this kind of fraud count on nobody ever having the patience to do it. 22 invoices, spread carefully across 11 different projects, so that no single job ever looked unusual on its own, all approved under Marcus's project manager authority, all paid to a supplier account that, when I finally traced the routing number, led back to an account with Marcus's own name quietly listed as a secondary holder. $218,000, moved a few thousand at a time, over roughly 22 months. Small enough, each time, to never trigger a second look. Large enough, altogether, to nearly sink us. I want to be honest about the exact moment the case turned personal, instead of professional. It was seeing my own signature, notarized and dated, sitting inside the loan application file directly beside a line that had been altered after the fact, to change my listed ownership percentage from 50 to 0. Someone had gone back into a saved draft and edited a field, after I had already signed the original. That is the moment I stopped thinking of this as an accounting discrepancy, and started thinking of it as something done specifically to me. I kept pulling threads, and the deeper I went, the less this looked like a man simply trying to quietly cut his wife out of a business for his own gain. The $410,000 wasn't going toward new equipment or expansion. The reasons plainly listed on the application. It was, according to a wire transfer log I finally traced through 3 linked accounts over 2 long nights, going toward covering a 2-year gap in the company's project cost accounting. A gap that traced back not to the warehouse lease I had privately blamed myself for all this time, but to invoices Marcus had been quietly inflating and skimming from almost since the day he joined us. The brutal winter, the subcontractor lawsuits that never fully made sense, the private guilt I had carried alone for 2 full years wasn't mine to carry at all. It never had been. Daniel's father, Walter, is a retired contractor himself, and he still stops by the office most Fridays out of nothing but habit, to sit with his coffee among men half his age. I went to see him instead of confronting Daniel directly, because Walter has never once lied to me in 11 years, and because something in those frightened texts told me he already knew more than anyone had said aloud. I was right. Walter sat me down in his garage, among tools he no longer uses but has never brought himself to sell, and he told me that 6 months earlier, Daniel had come to him in a genuine panic, having finally uncovered what Marcus had quietly done to the company's books over 2 years. Daniel was terrified that if the theft came to light through a normal audit or a routine loan review, the fraud investigation that would follow would drag the entire business, and me, by direct extension, through something neither of us had caused, and neither of us deserved. His plan, cowardly and misguided as it turned out to be, had been to quietly refinance around the shortfall himself, absorb the loss without ever telling me it had happened, believing, in some twisted and frightened way, that he was protecting me, rather than doing something to me. That doesn't make what he did right, Walter said, watching my face carefully, and I told him so, the same night he told me. But I wanted you to hear the whole truth from someone before you decide what to do with any of it. I asked Walter one more question before I left his garage that afternoon, because I needed it confirmed by someone with absolutely no reason to soften it for my sake, whether the accounting shortfall from those 2 hard years truly traced back to Marcus, and not to any decision I had personally made regarding that warehouse lease. Walter had already had our old business attorney quietly review the same transaction records I had spent 2 nights tracing myself. The answer was documented, dated, and completely unambiguous. It had never been me. Not for $1 single of it. I learned the rest of what happened 2 days later, from a call with Daniel's sister, Rachel, her voice still visibly unsteady on the line. She had been in the office the afternoon Daniel finally confronted Marcus, having pieced together, once Walter told him I already knew everything, that there was no more time left to manage the truth quietly. Rachel described the color leaving Marcus's face in stages, when Daniel laid the printed transaction history flat on the conference table between them, like watching someone slowly realize a door they'd believed was permanently locked had been standing open the entire time. She said Marcus tried 3 separate explanations before settling into silence on none of them. Rachel said the office had gone completely silent, the kind of silence where you can hear the building's heating system click on somewhere in another room. 2 crew foremen were in the doorway, having wandered in for something unrelated, and then simply frozen there, unwilling to leave, and unwilling to pretend they hadn't heard any of it. Marcus reached for his phone at one point, she said, as though he meant to call someone, and then set it back down on the table without dialing anyone at all, his hand visibly unsteady. And she said that when Daniel finally, quietly, said my name out loud in that room, said that I was the one who had found in 9 days what none of them had managed to find in 2 full years, Marcus looked, in her words, like a man watching his own reflection in a mirror, stop cooperating with him. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't deny it again after that. He just sat down, very slowly, in the chair across from the man he'd called his best friend for 6 years, and put both hands flat on the table like he needed something solid to hold on to. Daniel came to me that night and asked, carefully, if we could talk at the kitchen table, the same table where we had signed our partnership papers 11 years earlier, the same table where I'd read the loan application 9 days before. I let him speak first. He said he was sorry, that he had genuinely been trying to protect me from something he never wanted to touch our life together, that he was ashamed now of how he'd gone about it, that he had never once meant for me to discover it the way I had. He asked, quietly, staring at his own hands on the table, whether there was any way to undo the last 2 years. Not the theft itself, he clarified, but his silence about it. I would have helped you, I told him. If you'd come to me the night you found out about Marcus, I would have had the whole thing traced and documented inside a week, the way I just did anyway, except we would have done it together, and no bank would ever have seen my name turned into 0 on a government form. He didn't have an answer for that. He just kept saying he was sorry, that he'd panicked, that he never once stopped to think it through the way I would have. I told him I understood why he had done what he did. Fear makes people do strange, small, cowardly things, dressed up carefully as protection. But understanding why someone did something to you, and being willing to keep building a life beside them afterward, are 2 entirely different rooms, and I was no longer willing to live in the second one. You didn't only hide a theft from me for 2 years, I said, my voice steady, the same voice I use when I deliver difficult findings to a client across a conference table. You tried to legally erase my half of everything I built, to quietly solve a problem you created the moment you decided I couldn't be trusted with the truth in the first place. I don't forgive secrets that come with my own name deleted from the paperwork. The resolution that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. With Walter's help, and our attorneys, Marcus was formally removed from the company, and the misappropriated funds became the subject of a documented restitution agreement, rather than a courtroom battle none of us actually wanted made public. Daniel and I dissolved our marriage but not the business cleanly. My ownership stake was formally restructured, independently verified, and protected far beyond anything it had ever been on paper before, with Daniel bought out of all operational control over the following 18 months. He asked me once, near the very end of that process, whether there was any chance of trying again, as something other than business partners. I told him no, the same way you close the last page of a book, you already know the ending to, not with anger left in my voice, just with the quiet certainty that the story was, at last, finished. He asked a second time, weeks later, over the phone, and I gave him the same answer in the same tone, because some questions don't get a different response just because they're asked again more softly. There was no shouting in either conversation. There didn't need to be. I had already said everything I needed to say at that kitchen table, and I've never been the kind of person who repeats herself out of anger rather than necessity. A year later, I run the company myself. Whitfield Restoration Group still carries the name, because I earned every single letter of it, and because I decided a long time ago that I would not let someone else's fear cost me something I had built with my own hands and my own money, from a settlement I could have spent on anything else in the world. I also started something new on the side, a small consulting practice helping women review their own household and business paperwork line by line, teaching them to read operating agreements, and loan documents, and joint tax filings, the exact way I always insisted on reading mine. Most of my new clients arrive nervous, half apologizing for not understanding financial language that was never actually designed to be understood by the very person it affects most. I sit with them the way I once wished someone had sat with me, pointing to the exact line where a name disappears, the exact clause where an ownership stake can quietly be subordinated, the exact drop-down menu where 11 years of a person's life can be reduced to a single word like homemaker. I tell every one of them the same thing, without exception. You don't need to be an accountant to protect yourself. You only need to insist, always, on reading whatever has your name on it, and on asking who benefits the day you stop insisting. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer for what they did to you. Sometimes it's simply refusing, ever again, to disappear from your own paperwork. If you were Claire, would you have stayed to help rebuild the marriage once you learned the theft truly wasn't his fault? Or was the 2 years of secrecy itself unforgivable entirely on its own, regardless of his reasons? Tell me honestly what you would have done in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. If this story pulled you in the way I hope it did, subscribe for more. There are so many more stories like Claire's still waiting to be told.